Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to my talk on SQL Server Licensing, Pay Less, Get More. My name is Gethin Ellis, and I'll give you a little bit of information about myself in just a second. But I'd just like to thank Mike and all the organisers of this Data Saturday #1. I know since what happened at the end of last year with SQL Saturdays and everything else, there was a clamour to get these events back up and running, and I think the guys have done an excellent job. So I just want to say a big thank you to them for the efforts that they've put in, and I have used the slide deck. A big thanks to all the sponsors that have kindly contributed to make this event work. Without them, these events wouldn't be able to run as well as they do. But with all that said and done, the thank yous out the way, I will make a start. Now, I'll start by giving you a little bit of information about me. I've been working with SQL Server and the Microsoft Data Platform for about 20 years. And in that time, I've had a variety of different jobs. I've been a report writer, a web developer, and a DBA. But for the last 12 years, I've been running a small consulting and training business called gethinellis.com. And lately, we've partnered up with our good friends at Widen, and we offer a variety of data platform related services, from things like architecture and design, SQL Server migrations, health checks, performance tune-ups, and we're a training partner as well, so we can we can provide Microsoft training. Over the years, I've had a couple of books published on SQL Server and Azure, and I've written several training courses as well. If you'd like to just connect with me on LinkedIn or follow me on Twitter, I am there. My URLs are there. And if you've got any questions on the back of this session for me, you're more than welcome to send them to my email address. My email address is on the slide there. It's Gethin. It's not coming up very well. Actually, I probably picked the wrong slide layout for that information, but it's gethin@gethinellis.com. And if you want to connect on LinkedIn, if you're active on LinkedIn, then feel free to contact me on there. But as I said, any questions, we've only got a short amount of time, and licensing questions are usually pretty complex. We can take them offline and we can have a discussion afterwards. So that's absolutely fine if you want to do that. So what I'm going to do in this session, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. And it's based on real life events. So we're focused on licensing. And when I go out and speak to clients and customers, there's a theme that seems to follow licensing around. It is a bit of a minefield. What you can do, what you can't do. Do you need software assurance? What does software assurance actually give you? Well, we're going to try and address some of these today. So we're going to cover things like what SQL Server Editions do you need to license? We can talk about SQL Server and software assurance and why you might need both, right? And we look at the different licensing models. We look at core-based versus server plus Cal. We'll talk about how you go about licensing your SQL Server in both a virtual and a containerized environment. And we will also, I'll give you some licensing scenarios and what you can do, show you what you can do to potentially save some money on your licensing costs, right? SQL Server, there's no doubt about it, it's expensive. Right? Well, it's not cheap anyway, right? So if you get your architecture wrong, you can end up with quite a hefty licensing bill. So hopefully in this talk, we'll make SQL Server licensing a bit more clear, right, and show you what actions you can take to potentially save some money on your licenses. And it boils down to answering really just a handful of questions, right? Which edition of SQL Server do you really need? What's the workload and resource usage like for your SQL Server? How many users do you have? And will you be migrating into the cloud anytime soon? And to understand and answer these questions, right, we need a good understanding of the features you're currently using and so on and so forth. So we'll get the answer to those questions and we're going to be in a good place. So this is where my story gets interesting. Now the story here, it's based on real life events, but the party names have been changed to protect people's identity, right? But this is all based around a brewery, and it's called Old Brewery in my story. And Chelsea was the new CEO, right, of Old Brewery. Now, Old Brewery's been around for 100 years, but it's now getting some stiff competition from micro breweries and real ale producing cool cats, right? And Cat's Brew in particular is one of its closest rivals. It was established in the 2000s. It's got a real foothold in the marketplace, and it's really pushing on and doing really well. Now, the people at Cat Brew Right, everything they did seemed to work. Right, the cool cats at Cat Brew, everything they did seemed to work. Now Chelsea at Old Brewery, when she was chatting with other CIOs at industry conferences and things like that, discovered that the Cat Brewery were using analytics and data to make decisions around their products, around their marketing, around everything. Now, she didn't quite know what they were doing or how they were doing it. So she decided to do some investigations of her own so Old Brewery could potentially follow suit. Now, in doing this review and understanding the data that going on this digital transformation that she was hoping to take Old Brewery on, she reviewed the business budgets. And one area that came to her concern was her licensing costs. Right? SQL Server on its own was costing around about £500,000, or these days probably €500,000 as well. And she didn't know what she was getting for that spend. Now, she could see she wasn't able to see how Old Brewery was getting a return on investment, right? But she was sure that this was the area that Cat Brew held the upper hand and the advantage, and they were using that investment much more to their advantage. So, wanting more details, Chelsea, the CEO, did what all good managers and senior managers do in that situation. She called a meeting. Now, she invited to the meeting some of her key people in her IT department. Okay, and she was kind of under the impression that these people would be able to help her. She knew she needed to change, she knew she needed the business to change, but she didn't know how. So she invited her architect Andrew, her DBA Deborah, the IT manager Mark, and herself to the meeting. And the agenda was a series of questions that the CEO wanted answers to. Right? Why does our SQL Server licensing cost so much? What return on investment on that license can we get? Can we get more bang for our buck? How can we better utilize what we have to drive business growth? Okay, and what is it Cat Brew are doing so well that we can learn from and use ourselves? So at the meeting, Chelsea gave a brief introduction, right, that she thought Old Brewery needed to change. Its competition appeared more agile, more able to deliver to customers in areas that perhaps Old Brewery had struggled. Right? And she explained she thought the answer was in technology and data in particular, but she needed help from the team. Okay, Old Brewery, they were spending a lot on SQL Server licensing, but were they getting enough return on investment? Right? And then Chelsea opened up the discussion to the floor. Now, the IT manager Mark explained that the businesses, or the key business applications for Old Brewery, marketing, point of sale, website, stock control, CRM, finance, were all run on SQL servers, and they had been for a very long time. Right? Most of the products were off-the-shelf products, and they had followed most of the recommendations made to them by a vendor. Okay. Then Andrew said, Andrew's the architect, he said several years ago, we decided that all the infrastructure would run on virtual machines. Right? And the decision at the time was to license for maximum virtualization to give us flexibility. Right? We got three hosts, two in the production data center and one on the DR site, with all the cores licensed. That's 96 in total. Then Deborah, the senior DBA, she explained the existing SQL Server infrastructure. So Deborah said the business had a high availability and disaster recovery need, right? And availability groups were being used on all 5 of the production servers and all 5 of the UAT servers. So to make sure, and the reason it was set up that way was to make sure testing matched production, right? The SQL servers were getting old though. They're still on SQL Server 2012, okay? And Deborah is the only real person with a good knowledge of SQL Server. She's the only person with the skills in-house that could upgrade those servers, but she was busy with other work, like making sure the data warehouse was up to date for crucial management reports and things like that. Okay, now Deborah, the DBA, also mentioned that newer versions of SQL Server could help the organization make better use of data. It could help it make data-driven decisions, either through the cloud, Azure-based data platform based in Azure, or even on premises. And Chelsea, the CEO, was keen to learn more about this as Cat Brew, their big competitor, seemed to have an advantage in their favor when it came to reacting to market and demand changes. Now, Chelsea agreed that an upgrade of the infrastructure might be needed, but she wanted to get a handle on licensing first. Right? Now, she didn't have a lot of spare time. Did the senior DBA, so they get a consultant in to help make help make things better or help you understand better. Now, it's clear in that scenario, and this is very common in a lot of organizations and businesses, that no one person in Old Brewery had taken ownership of the SQL Server license position. Right? And while it's likely they are more than covered by their existing licenses, they may be in a position to save some money if they simply license a bit differently. Right? So it's become, in a lot of organizations, and it's very true in this scenario, it's become a bit of an elephant in the room. People don't like to talk about it. Now, to get the most out of your licensing, someone needs to own the licensing position and ask certain requirements or certain questions about the requirements. So let's just take a look at the Old Brewery license position. They've got three hosts running Hyper-V or VMware or hypervisor of your choice. They've got 32 cores in each, so they've got 96 cores in total. They've got 18 VMs are running across 3 hosts, and it costs them £529,000 to license that. Okay, so that's their current licensing position. Now, okay, how much can you save? Now, I'm a DBA background. When I'm delivering my SQL Server and Azure DBA training, I always make a joke. The DBA, the being a DBA stands for don't bother asking. It's either no or it depends, right? And the answer to how much you can save, it is really an it depends answer, right? It depends on your workload, the workload of your SQL Server. It depends on the edition you're using, the features you are using, and the current utilization. Right now, what we've got on screen here on the slide. And there are a couple of examples where we've helped save our customers money on licensing costs by re-architecting and redesigning their infrastructure. Okay, now Old Brewery could easily shave off about 63% of their existing licensing position. All right, that's the crux here. We could get that down. We could shave, if we really wanted to make savings in that area, we could get that down. And push it right down, right? But for other clients, we've got bills down from sort of 94,000 down to 50,000. For one household retailer, we've got it from 164,000 down to around 50,000. That's quite a significant saving. Now, I'll tell you how we managed to achieve that, right? But we need to understand what we need to pay for and how we can structure our bill. All right, so the first thing we need to talk about is SQL Server Editions. All right, what SQL Server Editions need a license? The answer is technically all of them, right? But only a couple of editions need a license you have to pay for. And the two main paid for editions are Enterprise Edition and Standard Edition. Right? Enterprise Edition, if you've got mission critical, high performance, high available security workloads, it comes with all the features that SQL Server has got to offer, then you might need Enterprise Edition, right? The Standard Edition, it delivers a fully featured database, right? And according to the marketing material, it's guided and driven towards mid-tier applications and data marts and things like that, right? These are the two editions that you have to pay for, right? These are the ones that are going to cost you money. And there are some other editions as well, so Express and Developer, where you need a license, right? But the license is free, you don't have to pay for it, all right? Express Edition, you can it's a free to distribute version. It's a cut down version of SQL Server with some strict limitations like database size and the amount of compute resources it can use and things like that. Developer Edition, that's Enterprise Edition, right? Except you're not allowed to use it in production. Now, until reasonably recently, I think it was 2016, it had a small cost associated with this. It was about $50 a user. But since 2016, Microsoft have made this free, and we'll talk more about Developer Edition and how it can be used to save you some money later in the talk. Now, when it comes to licensing on premises, Microsoft offer up a couple of options, and the option you've got is really going to depend on the edition that you're using. All right, you can take a Server plus Cal. Right, Server plus Cal licensing is where you buy a server license and you buy a license for each individual device or user that accesses that server. It's only available in Standard Edition, and then you can license per core. So as I said, the server plus cal, you license the server, and then the users and devices have an additional cal license. And this can be quite an effective licensing model when the number of users and devices is low and can be easily counted. All right. If you're unable to count your users, or you need the features of Enterprise Edition, then core-based licensing is you can only license Enterprise Edition using core-based licensing. With standard, you've got the option of both. Okay, and using core-based licensing, it gives users of SQL Server a more precise measure of the computing power and a more consistent licensing metric, regardless of whether your solution is deployed onto physical servers on premises or virtual servers on premises or the cloud. Now, the different editions, they've got different licensing models tailored to them. All right, we know we have to license Enterprise using per core, and with standard, you get that choice. Right, and what you're going to pick is going to depend on the number of users, whether they can easily be counted, the actual number of users, and the devices needed to connect to SQL Server can be more efficient for a small number of users. But if your usage is going to grow, then there's a fair chance it'll quickly become a more costly way of licensing your SQL Server. Okay, so we've spoken about licensing individual machines, and this is what we're going to focus on. We've talked about the different licensing methods or the editions that we need to license. We're now going to talk about how we can approach licensing our different machines. So if you've got a physical server and you're licensing that server, you can license an individual server using the per core method. So you buy a SQL Server license for each core in that server. Okay, so when you're running it on a physical machine, all the cores on that server must have a license, and it must have a minimum of 4 core license as well, right? And that's actually needed for each physical processor in the server. So I've got, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Peppa Pig, but that's Mr. Fox, all right? And he's a character from a kids' TV show called Peppa Pig. Now, Mr. Fox, he's got a back of his van, right? He's got a van. He's a bit of a sort of wheeler dealer. He can sell anything from the back of his van type character. Now, Mr. Fox would sell SQL Server licenses in packs of 2 from the back of his van, right? So we would need at least 2 packs for SQL Server. If you go down the standard route in Server plus Cal, you buy a license for the server, and then each client access would need a Cal license. Okay, if you're accessing any of SQL Server's components, you would need that. Now, a Cal, it's not software, it's just a license granting users and devices access to the SQL Server software. So that's physical individual machines. Then we throw in virtualization, right? So that adds to the complexity a little bit. Now, with SQL Server running on a VM, you can either license the individual VM, which works in a very similar way that I just described on licensing a physical machine, or you can license for maximum virtualization. Right now, maximum virtualization might be more cost effective if you're working in a highly virtualized environment. Now, what maximum virtualization? It involves licensing the entire host, right? The entire hypervisor host with your enterprise core licenses, and then covering those licenses with software assurance. All right, so if you want to license an individual machine, you license the virtual cores in each VM. There's a minimum 4 core license required for each VM. Okay, if you want to license an individual virtual machine using Server plus Cal for standard edition, you license each virtual machine with a server license and then a user or device Cal for each user or device. And then maximum virtualization, we fully license the host with SQL Server Enterprise Edition software assurance, and then we can deploy an unlimited number of virtual machines. Now, SQL Server 2017 introduced support for deployment to containers, right? And this will allow users of SQL Server to deploy SQL Server to containers using sort of things like Docker technology and things like that. Containers are they work in a similar way to virtualization, right? They give that operating system level virtualization, so you can have isolated applications running on a single operation. So what containers are really useful for, they're really good for sort of rapid deployment scenarios. You can separate application services through microservices deployments, and they allow things to be scaled up and scaled down quite easily as well. But they do differ. They're similar, but they are different from virtual machines, right? They provide, a virtual machine will provide operating system level virtualization. So with a container, all the containers are sharing the same operating system. Okay, so it gives that application isolation, but not the operating system isolation. They're less resource intensive. They require much less overhead to run. They can be started and scaled rapidly. They give you a lot of portability. Now, whereas on a virtual machine level, we get that hardware level virtualization. Each VM will have its own operating system environment, its own virtual memory and virtual cores allocated, and that provides full isolation from other virtual machines. Now, for licensing, right, an operating system environment is defined as all or part of an operating system instance, or all or part of a virtual operating system instance. So containers and virtual machines are structured differently, but from a licensing perspective, they're considered the same. So if you're using one container with 6 cores on Enterprise Edition SQL Server, you would need a 6-core license to cover the container. All right. So we know they're treated the same way. So if you want to license individual containers using a per core licensing model, you license the virtual cores in each container with a minimum of 4. All right, so if you've got 3 containers with 2, 4, and 6 cores respectively, we would need 12. That's a total of 12 cores. We would need a 14-core license to cover this position. Right, and the reason for that is you have to have a minimum of a 4-core license. So a container with 2 cores still needs a 4-core license. Right, now, Server plus Cal Standard Edition, you can license each container with a server license, and you can license each user with a Cal. Right, so it's a similar way. So in the example on the screen here, we've got 2 containers with 2 processors and one with 4. The number of cores are irrelevant because we're licensing with Server plus Cal. So we need a server license for each container, and then we need 2 server licenses with 3 user devices. So we need 3 Cals. But like licensing for maximum virtualization, there's something called license for maximum density. So if you've got a host with, say, 2 processors and 6 cores, we need 2 sets of 6 cores, right? 12 licenses. It's covered in that thing. And licensing for maximum density, you fully license the server with enterprise core license, cover them with software assurance, and you can deploy an unlimited number of containers. Without software assurance, there is a limit to the number of instances you can deploy. In this case, it would be 12, one for each core license. Now, SQL Server 2019 brought some new features, and some of these new features might be interesting to old brewery as they're going on their data analytics journey. The big data clusters in SQL Server 2019, they allow you to have your relational databases and your big data solutions all in one place. Right? So through the concept of SQL Server 2019 big data clusters, those components need licensing as well. Okay, so if you're looking to go down that route, it's important to remember there's a licensing position to consider. So if you've got a SQL Server master instance, so the server running the SQL Server master instance needs to be assigned an appropriate number of SQL Server 2019, either enterprise or standard edition core licenses. And the SQL Server big data nodes, so these servers are used, the servers used for these big data nodes, they need to be licensed again using SQL Server big data node cores. And there's a software assurance benefit for these big data nodes and the core entitlement here as well. It'll give you a limited number of big data node core licenses at no additional costs. And if you've got deployments that exceed that software assurance benefit, they're going to need to be licensed with a big SQL Server big data node core license as well. Okay, so just to be aware, there is a license position for those tools and features. Now, do you need software assurance? You probably do. There's probably a number of benefits in there that make it really useful for you. So you need to have you need to have that software assurance to make sure you can take advantage of the license flexibility Microsoft grants by having a software assurance license. Now, there are a number of benefits that you get with software assurance, and these have been available for a long time, but they have changed for SQL Server 2019, and those changes were announced when SQL Server were released to market. So the unlimited virtualization, where you can run any number of instances of SQL Server Enterprise Edition, an unlimited number of VMs when you license all the cores in the underlying host has been there. You can have a failover server, so you can have a passive SQL Server instance in a separate operating system environment for high availability in anticipation of a failover. This Power BI report server covered under SQL Server Enterprise customers as well, so you can run Power BI report server on premises. There's been some machine learning stuff. License mobility, right? This is kind of a key point. You've always been able to, with software assurance, reassign SQL Server licenses within your estate more than once every 90 days. Okay, and there's some other benefits as well, but that's kind of what they bring to you, right? And there are some hybrid cloud benefits. We're going to come back and revisit the software assurance benefits because to see how they've changed in 2019, and we'll do that in just a second. But if you've got software assurance, there's some hybrid cloud benefits as well. Okay, so these are Azure benefits that Microsoft give to its customers who have got SQL Server licenses with software assurance. They basically get a reduced base rate on certain Azure SQL database and vCore options and managed instances. The hybrid benefit is probably the most cost-effective way to run a managed instance in Azure. Okay. So the hybrid benefits in here, you've got the ability to move licenses to a fully managed PaaS offering. You get something like 4 cores in the cloud for every 1 core on premises for Enterprise Edition customers, right, for general purpose and hyperscale service tiers. And you get dual use rights as well. So you get 180 days where you can run your on-premises and third-party cloud or third-party cloud to allow you to do your migration. Right, so you can run your system side by side at no extra cost for 180 days. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about the software assurance benefits, there were some significant changes made to this back in November 2019, which doesn't feel all that long ago, but it actually is 18 months ago now. Now, the benefits, excuse me, we've spoken about some of these already. We talked about the big data core entitlement and some of the licensing you get there. So you get limited number of big data node cores for your big data clusters. But there are some other benefits for SQL Server that were introduced when SQL Server 2019 was released, but they apply back to all in support versions of SQL Server, so all the way back to SQL Server 2012. So the failover server for high availability, right? That's always been there, but that's still a benefit of software assurance. But you can now have a failover server for disaster recovery, so you can install and run a passive instance or a separate instance of SQL Server in a separate operating system environment on premises for disaster recovery in anticipation of a failover event. And you can have a failover server for disaster recovery in Azure as well. So you can have that passive instance up in Azure to allow for a disaster recovery or failover event or situation. There's some other benefits of software assurance, right? Previously, you couldn't carry out any operations, things like backups and consistency checks, on the secondary that was being used for HA if it was in a passive state, i.e. you didn't have a license for it, right? If you wanted to do that, you would need to license the server. But from November 2019, you can do certain operations like consistency checks, log backups, full backups, and monitor resource usage on your passive replicas without the need for a license. Okay, so we've spoken about the different editions. We've spoken about the editions that need a license. We've talked about software assurance. We've talked about the benefits that software assurance give you, and it probably is worth having both. Now I'm going to look at a couple of different scenarios, right, where we're going to look at high availability, application mobility, and non-production. And getting these right again can help you save some money on your licensing position. Excuse me. So SQL Server, it can be configured so that if one server fails, the processing is going to be picked up by another server. All editions of SQL Server on Windows give some basic high availability features, be it log shipping, basic availability groups, two-node failover clustering, advanced always on high availability features are SQL Server Enterprise Edition features. All right, so if you need things like multiple readable secondaries or multi-site failover clustering, then you're going to need Enterprise Edition. All right, but SQL Server, well, if you're licensing, you need to consider your licensing position. Okay, so for a high availability and disaster recovery solution to be effective, right, what we have to do is build redundancy into our system. Right, now that might take the form of other virtual machines, physical or virtual, and these are set up to run the workload should the primary server fail. Now, how do you go about licensing those VMs? Right, now with the software assurance benefit, we know we get a certain amount free as long as they are passive, but there are strict rules around how we license these servers, and that change in November 2019, it relaxed the rules a little bit, and that change alone can actually save you some money on your licenses. So in the image on the screen, the primary replica, so under the old rules is on the right, on the left, and then new rules are on the right. All right, but the primary replica, or the active replica, it's got 12 cores in it. Right, the HADR solution has two secondary replicas, one in synchronous commit mode for high availability and supports automatic failover, and one using asynchronous commit mode, and it's a replica for disaster recovery without automatic failover. Under the old rules, the disaster recovery site would need to be licensed. Okay, so with the announcement of that new software assurance benefit in November 2019, the number of server core licenses required to operate this topology would only be 12 cores as opposed to 24, as long as your DR site is passive. If you're in that situation before and you bought those cores, there's a fair chance you might be doing some reporting or something off that secondary, under which case you would still need the license. So as long as they remain truly passive, you won't need to license that server anymore. Then we need to talk about license mobility, failing over. Right, and this is particularly appropriate for a virtual environment. Right? And license mobility is a software. This right is available for all editions of SQL Server that are covered by a software assurance agreement. And what it allows you to do is reassign SQL Server licenses to different servers within your farm as often as needed. Right? And you can also share your licenses or reassign your licenses to third-party shared servers like a cloud provider. Okay, this right is available under both the per core and server plus cal licensing models as well. Okay, so it allows you to fail over between different hosts in your environment without restriction. Without it, there would be a limitation on how often you could do that. All right, so SQL Server licenses that are not covered with an active software assurance license, they can only be reassigned to a different server within your farm once every 90 days, and they cannot be reassigned to a third-party web hoster or non-private cloud. Okay, I'm pretty certain in the event of a sort of permanent hardware failure, Microsoft they would waive the 90-day reassignment limit, but there are restrictions around it. So all SQL Server licenses with an active software assurance agreement can be reassigned to another server within the farm as often as needed. Okay, so if you're doing cool stuff like rebalancing your virtual machines in using the hypervisor to do it, or you want to fail over for packaging and things like that, then you're able to do it if you're covered by software assurance as regularly as you want to. Okay. There are some sort of limitations around what constitutes an estate or a farm, right? So we can reassign these licenses to another server within the farm as often as needed. A server farm, Microsoft defines that as up to 2 data centers located in time zones that are within 4 hours of each other, and or within the European Union or the European Free Trade Association. And a given data center can only be part of one server farm. So this license mobility benefit can really benefit customers who perhaps license individual virtual machines or containers, and they might want to reassign those licenses to different servers in the farm. They want to move their workload dynamically or to VMs in the cloud and so on and so forth, right? So it's probably why, or one of the reasons why we probably need software assurance. And then we get into, this is an interesting area, licensing your non-production environments. There can be efficient ways of doing that as well. Okay, so customers, you need a license for every Microsoft product you install, configure, and use, right? Including all physical and virtual instances. Now, as such, licensing a development and test environment could be particularly expensive and particularly challenging, as you might want to, if you're working in an agile way, you might be spinning things up and spinning things down quite quickly. Okay, now Microsoft offers multiple cost-effective options for licensing your SQL Server in a non-production environment, and getting this right can really help reduce your licensing bill. So SQL Server Developer Edition, right? We know it's a fully featured version of SQL Server. It includes all the features and capabilities of Enterprise Edition, but it's licensed for development, test, and demonstration purposes. Right? You can't use Developer Edition in production or with commercial data. You may install and run the Developer Edition on any number of devices, which is quite significant because it allows you to run software on multiple devices for testing purposes without having to license each non-production server system. Okay. Now, a production environment is defined as an environment that's accessed by end users, right? Application traffic, internet traffic, applications hitting that database server, and it's used for more than gathering feedback or acceptance testing of that application. All right. Other scenarios that constitute a production environment are things like if it connects to a production database, the environment is there to support disaster recovery or backup for a production environment, or environments that are used for production at least some of the time. All right. So if it gets rotated in and out of production during peak periods. Now, it's going to be uncommon for someone whose role is designing, developing, and testing, right, would qualify as an end user of the software. So getting your non-production right can be quite effective. Okay, so how much do the licenses cost? We've spoken about what we need to license, and let's look at some figures. Now, these prices on the screen, these are the recommended retail prices. The price you actually get will depend on who you buy your licenses off, your license service provider or crowd service provider. Okay, but off the website, Enterprise Core Edition per 2-core pack comes in at just over 14,000 US dollars, which in pounds is around about 11,000 pounds. Right, per 2-core pack. Standard edition, a per 2-core pack is in the $3,700, okay, which is about £2,875. When I did the conversion, please allow for currency fluctuations in there. Server plus CAL for standard edition. The server license is $931, which is about £720, plus the $209 or £162 per client access license. And then in terms of software assurance, that is around about 30% of your licensing costs per 3 years. All right. Now I see software assurance as a necessary cost. All right. At a minimum, if you wanted Enterprise Edition SQL Server, you've got to license at least 4 cores, right, which comes to £22,000. To get the full benefit of HA and DR and the license flexibility provided by software assurance, you're going to need to add another 30% on top of that, which brings it in at around £28,000. So it's not cheap. Okay, and if we go back to the example, the 12-core example we had earlier on, under the old rules, we'd have needed a 24-core license plus software assurance to run that configuration. That would come in, just working that out under the old rules, at around about just over $200,000. Under the new rules, it's cut in half to $100,000. That's a big saving. Now, as I said earlier on, the key to saving money with your licensing boils down to answering a couple of questions. Choose the correct edition for your environment, and in order to do that, we need to ask and answer questions such as, is it a production environment? If it's not a production environment, can we use developer edition? It's free after all. If you can't use developer edition for whatever reason, you need to see if there's a better way of licensing those servers, like using MSDN or some other licensing format that you can talk to Microsoft that can significantly reduce those as well. Are we going to use, or do we need any of the enterprise edition features? Right. So, for example, we need high availability and disaster recovery, right? But is the high availability and disaster recovery solutions in standard edition enough? Right? You can have a failover cluster instance or a basic availability group in standard edition. Now, the basic availability groups are one database per availability group is a little bit painful. So if you want to go down the availability group route, I still would suggest using Enterprise Edition. But you can have it in there, and it can be really useful. But what I would say is only use Enterprise Edition if you absolutely have to and absolutely need to. How else can you save money? Well, you can consolidate your SQL servers, and to do that, we need to know what is running and what our workload is on that server. All right. So, assuming that you license, you're licensing your cores, and you know your workload and your capacity and your usage. Now, when I started out as a DBA 20 years ago, I wanted my SQL Server to be used as little as possible. I wanted CPU and the utilization of it to be as close to zero as I could get it. In order to get the most out of my licensing, though, and the way the licensing model has changed means I needed to change my mindset. I now need to squeeze every last cycle out of the CPU in terms of compute resources. Right? If I scale these up, my licensing costs go up. And if you're using standard edition, choose the most cost-effective license model. If you've got a small number of devices, Server and Cal can be quite effective. The problem with Server and Cal, as the number of devices and users increases, it can quickly become less efficient for larger environments. So make those decisions wisely. Okay, so in terms of our case study and what we did with the brewery, we were able to reduce their workload from 96 cores down to 24. Right? There was no changes in the number of instances. We were able to make use of some of the high availability features, and we really got their bill down by 68%, down to 174,000. And we did that in a couple of ways by making sure that basically we have to ensure that one of the environments was never never in use unless it was a true DR situation. But we were able to reduce the exposure on the number of cores to 24, and in doing that all on its own, we got the cost down quite significantly. But there are some other case studies I want to share with you here. All right, so we've got some examples here of where we've gone through this process and we've managed to save customers money on licenses, and it all comes down to reducing the workload, reducing the number of cores, and in some cases changing the edition. So for there's a financial body who has to remain nameless. They had a 46 core exposure. We got that down to 34. We got 20 servers down into 9 instances, and then we got the editions. They did need enterprise for some, and they did need well, they actually didn't need enterprise for many, but we got the editions down to standard and developer. Okay, and if they stayed as they was, their position would have been 94,000 and change. After a consolidation and simplifying their environment, it's now 50,000. So it's like saved in half, right? And then they bought some managed service and stuff off us for that as well. Well, not in that price, but they bought some managed services as well, which again meant the environment was being looked after, so it was better. From the household retailers group, where we managed to save some money there, they had performance issues with some availability groups, they have dedicated series. So we redesigned and removed the need for enterprise edition. All right. They allowed them then to, well, they were able to virtualize, but the issues they were having with their old server meant they couldn't virtualize it. But we improved their availability. We changed the edition they were using. And again, they stayed as is. It cost them £164,000 by going through a consolidation process. We shaved a significant sum off that for them and got their license bill down to 52. Okay, that is pretty much the end of what I've got to talk about. I've got some questions here, and I've got some, people like, how does an audit work? And true up is based on trust, but you can get fully audited, and Microsoft will come in and run various other things on your environment. I've added in what constitutes production, which is a question that's always asked. If anybody has any questions, feel free to send them through. I'm a little bit early. It's about a 50-minute session normally, and I've got through it a bit quickly. But if anyone's got any questions, please post them here. Oh, there we go. There's a question, and then my apologies, I haven't seen that.
If you need any help reading the question in the chat, I can read you.
I'm just loading now, Mike. I've got them all done.
Or we can also invite asking people to open their mic and do their questions.
Yeah. So Air Caller's asked, in case of server plus CAL, to guarantee license mobility, the SA can only be for the server license, not the CAL. Sure, in a way, cannot use recent version of SQL Server. So you can still license standard edition with server plus CAL. I think you're right. I think the software assurance would apply to the server license because that's what you're likely to be moving. But I'm also certain if you need to switch out a device, so let's just say you've got, someone's got a user access license to access their reporting environment and they have a CAL, you're right. It wouldn't. I don't think it would be covered. It would necessarily be covered by that. You need for each potential device they're going to connect with. I think that's the thing. It's not possible to use developer edition with production data. So Leonardo, it's not possible to use developer edition with production data. So for example, for UAT pre-prod, which we usually refresh weekly and monthly, I think what you could do there, Leonardo, is say, well, once it's no longer in production, it's not production data anymore, becomes test data. And I'm assuming you're going to do things like anonymize it. This is for UAT. I'll talk about UAT. I'll talk about pre-prod. Pre-prod might be a bit more of a difficult case to make, but for UAT, as long as it's user acceptance testing, and you want to be testing on volumes of data, so it's very common to take a copy of your production database and you're probably anonymizing the data that's going into UAT. I wouldn't have a problem with developer edition there. I do say with pre-prod, that sounds a bit more production-y. That might. I'd be a little reluctant to say use developer edition for pre-prod. And then when I buy a license with software assurance after the first 3 years of contract, can I only pay to maintain SA 30% of the initial costs? I don't, when it comes to renewals, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that, Ercol, but I will look it up and I'll get back to you. And then, well, that was it. That was the last one. Cool.